Okay, let's dive in. Some studies show well, a pretty noticeable jump in what everyday Americans paid for things like steel products,
Yeah.
after those tariffs came in.
Right. It really highlights how these big economic policies don't just stay in the realm of economics, they ripple out.
Exactly. And that's what we're really digging into today. We're looking at the Trump administration's tariffs, their economic effects. Based on this analysis, the Trump tariffs tank a descent into authoritarianism.
Mm. It's a fascinating piece because it doesn't just stop at the dollars and cents. It asks, were these tariffs standalone economic moves?
Or part of something bigger.
Yeah, part of a potential shift in, let's say, the style of governance itself.
So that's our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Understand the economic fallout, sure, but also explore those, more challenging arguments in the analysis,
Mm.
the ones connecting trade policy to maybe a drift towards authoritarianism.
And I'm here to help sort of connect those dots, provide some context, and look at the patterns the analysis points to.
Great. So let's start with the tariffs themselves. The way they were pitched initially was all about protecting American industries, right? Bring jobs back.
That was definitely the narrative. Make imports pricier, give U.S. companies an edge, protect the home front, basically.
But the analysis suggests the reality was, different. It talks about consumer prices actually going up. How did that work?
Well, think about basic materials. Steel, aluminum. Tariffs on those meant U.S. companies using them had higher costs.
Ah, okay.
And often what do companies do with higher costs? They pass them on.
To us, consumers.
Exactly. So things made with that steel or aluminum cars, appliances, even like canned soup could get more expensive.
And it wasn't just shoppers feeling it. The analysis points a finger at the impact on American farmers, a group that, was often seen as supportive of the administration.
Oh, absolutely. This is a really crucial part of the analysis, retaliation. When the U.S. put tariffs on goods, other countries, especially China, hit back.
And they targeted agriculture.
They did. Soybeans are the big example mentioned. U.S. soybean farmers relied heavily on exports, particularly to China. Suddenly, that market just dried up because of retaliatory tariffs.
So prices dropped.
Plummeted. Farmers were stuck with huge amounts of soybeans they couldn't sell. It led to real financial distress, farm closures even. It showed just how vulnerable agriculture was to these trade fights.
That seems counterintuitive. Policies meant to protect ended up hurting some of those same groups. Did the analysis say why this happened, like miscalculations?
The argument presented is that there was maybe an underestimation of how interconnected everything is globally, and perhaps not enough thought given to how trading partners would inevitably react. The focus was maybe too narrow on just one part of the economy without seeing the ripple effects elsewhere.
Okay, so beyond the direct economic impact, the analysis then shifts. It starts talking about the border, specifically militarizing the border. How does that connect to tariffs?
Well, the analysis frames it as part of that broader potential shift in governance we mentioned. It looks at the economic disruptions and the border policies together.
So things like the border wall.
Exactly. The wall, increased presence of CBP and ICE agents, stricter deportation rules. The analysis suggests these weren't just about managing immigration flows.
The stated goal was always national security, deterring illegal crossings.
Right, and that was the justification given. Public safety, controlling the border, that's standard for any administration to some extent.
But critics argued it went further, creating fear in immigrant communities.
Yeah, concerns about accessing services, about, just living day to day without that constant anxiety.
And the analysis takes it another step, right? Brings up this idea of demographic control.
It does. It posits that maybe, just maybe, these intense border measures and immigration crackdowns weren't only about security, but potentially about influencing who makes up the population, particularly potentially marginalizing minority groups, especially near the border. The idea being perhaps to shape communities to be more politically aligned with certain viewpoints.
That's a very serious claim. To suggest policy was aimed at changing the country's demographic makeup? I mean, couldn't stronger border security just be stronger border security? Where does the analysis draw that line?
The analysis points to the intensity and the type of measures used, arguing they went beyond what you might consider typical security steps.
Okay.
And it also highlights the rhetoric used at the time, words like invasion, linking immigration very strongly to national identity in a way that suggested more than just border control. Plus, the disproportionate effect on certain ethnic groups is factored in.
And then there's this phrase used, chilling perspective, about potential future policies, relocation segregation. That sounds extreme.
It does sound extreme. The analysis raises it as a concern, a potential trajectory. If you take these trends to a possible conclusion, you could see policies that might fracture communities, weaken cultural identities.
And that obviously raises huge ethical questions.
Profound ones about who belongs, how we define community, especially when politics are already so polarized.
To really understand the gravity of that idea, the analysis then brings in history. It talks about forced relocation in America's past.
Yeah, it makes connections to some very dark chapters, specifically slavery and the era of segregation.
That's a stark comparison.
It is. But the point is to show historical precedent. Slavery wasn't just exploitation, it was the forced movement, the denial of rights, the complete dehumanization of African Americans.
And segregation continued that, even after slavery ended. Jim Crow laws.
Exactly. Institutionalized separation, racial zoning, denying opportunities based purely on race. It permeated everything.
So the analysis is saying, look at these modern policies, things like strict border control or maybe even economic policies that disproportionately affect certain groups.
And see the potential echoes. See how systemic issues rooted in those past injustices might still play out today in things like housing access, job opportunities, social mobility for marginalized groups.
It's a warning then, to be vigilant about policies that might seem unrelated but could erode freedoms.
That's the core idea. Learning from the past to avoid repeating those patterns, even if they look different on the surface. Recognizing how rights can be chipped away, which can be a sign of, well, authoritarian tendencies.
Which brings us directly to that term,
Yeah.
authoritarianism. The analysis links this to the political rhetoric,
Yeah.
particularly around former President Trump.
Yes, it notes what it sees as a rise in, let's call it, authoritarian sentiment in the political sphere.
How does the analysis define that? Authoritarianism.
Generally, it refers to a concentration of power, less respect for democratic norms, checks and balances, individual rights, that sort of thing. The analysis suggests that sometimes the lines blurred between traditional conservatism and actions or statements that leaned more towards authoritarianism.
Normalizing things that maybe weren't considered normal before.
That's part of the concern raised.
Yeah.
And also a strong push towards nationalism, sometimes presented as being in conflict with democratic processes or international cooperation.
And the analysis mentions the way opposition was treated.
Right. The tendency to frame political dissent not just as disagreement, but as unpatriotic or worse.
Which can definitely shut down debate, makes people hesitant to speak out.
It can. And the analysis warns about desensitization. If extreme rhetoric or proposals become constant, people might start to accept them as just politics as usual.
Losing that critical edge.
Exactly. Which undermines the public's ability to push back against policies that might be genuinely harmful to democracy. So recognizing those signs early on is presented as really vital.
Public awareness, open discussion.
Crucial for safeguarding liberties, according to this perspective.
Okay, tied into this is the role of what the analysis calls far-right networks. How do they fit into this picture of tariffs and potential authoritarianism?
The analysis argues these networks have become, well, more influential in politics. They aren't just fringe groups anymore.
How do they operate?
Through lots of channels. Social media obviously is huge, but also grassroots organizing, think tanks, even connecting with formal political structures. The goal, as the analysis presents it, is often to shift public opinion, sometimes reinforcing racial hierarchies or pushing specific social norms.
And they get funding from various places.
Seems so. Ideological donors, maybe political actors, sometimes even international links are mentioned. They're quite effective at tapping into existing anxieties.
Like economic worries?
Or immigration.
Precisely. Framing these complex issues in very simple, often us versus them terms, pointing to perceived threats, external or internal.
And digital platforms help spread that message quickly.
Massively. For organizing, fundraising, spreading ideology, and yes, spreading misinformation too. The analysis sees these networks as actively working to promote ideas that align with authoritarianism, challenging dissent, questioning diversity.
So it's more than just individual politicians. It's these organized efforts pushing certain ideas. That's the argument, yes. Understanding how these networks function is key to understanding the broader trends being discussed.
But the analysis doesn't end on a completely negative note, does it? It talks about resistance and awakening.
Right. It suggests that some of these very policies and trends, including the tariffs and their fallout, actually spurred a reaction.
People pushing back.
Exactly. A rise in grassroots activism. Different kinds of people, diverse communities coming together locally to challenge what they saw as government overreach or unfair policies.
And social media played a role there too, not just for the networks.
Correct. It was also a tool for organizing protests, sharing information, demanding accountability. We saw collective action, like peaceful demonstrations, people showing up at town halls, advocacy groups forming, educational efforts,
All aimed at civic engagement.
and specifically at pushing back against perceived authoritarian tactics. The analysis really stresses that this kind of vigilance, this collective action, is fundamental.
So there's a sense that even amid these concerning trends, citizen action matters.
Immensely. It underscores the idea that democracy isn't passive, it requires active participation and awareness.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. We've gone through this analysis, the Trump tariffs tank, a descent into authoritarianism. We started with the tariffs, how they were meant to help, but according to the analysis, led to higher prices for consumers and real pain for farmers, partly due to underestimating retaliation.
Uh-huh. Then we move to the border, the increased militarization, and that really provocative argument about potential demographic control aims, which the analysis linked unsettlingly to historical precedents like slavery and segregation.
Right. And that led us into the discussion about authoritarian rhetoric becoming more mainstream, the role far-right networks play in amplifying that, and the danger of the public becoming desensitized.
But we finished on that note of resistance, how these very measures also sparked activism, community organizing, and a renewed focus on civic engagement as a way to safeguard democratic norms.
So bringing this back to you, our listener, the key takeaway seems to be how interconnected these things can be. And economic policy isn't just an economic policy.
Absolutely. It can have far-reaching social, political consequences. Understanding that complexity is, well, pretty crucial if you want to be an informed citizen.
We hope this deep dive gives you food for thought. Keep talking about these issues. Stay informed about how policies actually affect people and, remain watchful about the health of our democratic processes.
And perhaps leave you with this question to think about. When you consider history, like the forced relocations mentioned, and you see the kind of rhetoric discussed in the analysis today, what do you think are the most important things we need to do or protect to keep democratic values and individual rights strong in the years ahead?